Well, welcome back to our first section on outlining, especially elementary level outlining, called clusters. You know, when you have a new student come in, a very young student, and they're coming for their audition, or their younger sibling comes, or you're at a recital and the younger siblings run up to the piano, what is the first thing they do? And what's the first thing we do? Tell them to quit messing around and stop doing that to the piano. But when you stop to think about it, it's this splashing, which is the terminology that Whiteside talked about, that's actually the first lesson in keyboard geography. After all, we hope they're not going to sit in a 5-finger pattern or, you know, the extended 5th or thumb into 6th and 7ths forever. We want them to be able to eventually play around the piano, like a jazz pianist that improvises. They're not sitting in a little 5-finger pattern. True, that's how many of our structured curriculums start, but we want them to see that bigger picture of what they can do. And the more pieces we give them that have this up and back, even if it's all just patterns, is wonderful. And it develops that ability to understand that there's a world beyond, you know, the level 1 or level 2 pieces that stay in one place. Whiteside had a philosophy too, that often us as teachers, or if you're a pedagogy student, you feel pressured because the parent wants to hear that piece come out of that child, that they can play pieces. And of course, we want them to do it too. But it's very important that in your early lessons, or even throughout when you're warming them up, let them do a little bit of this feeling of splashing so they get that sense of opening their arms, moving around the piano, that freedom that prevents them from locking up here and locking up their back and sitting in the perfect little position. Now, part of that also, when we get them set up, is to work clusters in their very earliest pieces. Now, what I have attempted to do today is use books that I'm hopeful that you're using in your studios. This one, first piece is called, you'll see it up on your screen, is Cobblestone Road by Alexander Reinagel, noted as our first published composer in the United States. And you find this in On Your Way to Succeeding with the Masters by Helen Marley. This is the elementary level. Now, looking at this piece, it's a upper treble C position with the left hand on, thumb on C. And if you were to start this traditionally, even if you said, I'm going to have them do the right hand alone for the first 2 lines, you're liable to hear this. What is the student doing? They're making sure they have the rhythm right, but they're also just punching each note. What we want to do is encourage them to think in groupings and think musically. I tell my students each of those notes is an alphabet letter. It doesn't have any individual meaning. It's when you combine them into words. So for example, if each measure is a word and at the end of the phrase we have a sentence, I'm going to have them, I'll be up here demonstrating with my right hand and they'll be here and I'll say, gee, let's start and just try to play a grouping for each measure. And again, I urge you not to be legalistic. Let's just say this first measure, as you can see from the example, is a C major triad, but you don't have to worry to death. If they just play the G and the C, that's fine. The next one is a C. Now we have stepwise. Let them feel that before they've even played single notes. Now the fourth measure, F, E, D, C, we're going to let them just feel that. So you're up here and they're down here and you're just playing around is what you're doing. Now they may go home and try it that way or they may not. But after you've introduced that for what, 30 seconds, you're going to say, okay, well let's just see if we can play the beginning 2 measures, but think of your groupings and see if you can get. And more importantly, measures 3 and 4, let's see if by doing those clusters first, you can get more musicianship from the beginning and train their eyes and their ears to not accept In another video on transfer students, we're going to talk about how often, which is more than 90% of the time, transfer students come in and they have learned the pieces note by note. and it sounds it. There's accents everywhere you don't want. They don't really comprehend the feeling of the beautiful musical line. So the first, most simplest thing that you can do is clusters. And you can use it in advanced pieces where, you learn the clusters first before you break it up so that your hand gets the feeling of what's underneath it. We'll talk about that when we move into more advanced literature in later videos. But here's a perfect way. Then you're going down later to lines 3 and 4, and then you can even, that's line 3. What about doing it in rhythm? You have 4/8 notes, right? So how about, so by the time this child walks home with this first piece, you've actually helped them think of it in larger units and in the melody line. So whether they actually at a young age practice this way at home, they may actually like that because that's something they get to do that most often would not. And it gets them out of saying, okay, here's my position and my finger is curved and my thumb is on its side and I'm going to push each note down. It helps, aids in getting that more musical line worked in from the very beginning. One of the dangers I see often in students that have been allowed to learn note by note is that they play that way and their ears are shut down. So when you explain this to a 10, 11, 12, 13-year-old and try and get that more musical playing, their ears are used to being pretty dead. They're pretty much used to trying to push down notes. These are all things that you can build that creativity into your studio, build that idea from lesson 1 that they're making music. That's what we want to do, is make music. Now let's move on to, after they've done that, you can close it. I call it closing the phrase and then open it up. My students know what I mean now. Open it up means you're going to play it as written. So that's just but one example, but do you see how with just those simple clusters you could go all the way through a primary book and through level 1 with clusters alone and get a lot out of it? That's just one way. Now we're going to move on in the next section to talking about blocking, which is an essential, one of the easiest ways to practice. And we'll be right back.